Be a reach to say that there were some racists in the Adventist church, maybe even in the leadership of the church, because our history shows that there was a separation. There were issues with worshiping together. Is that a reach, or is it possible that there were some in the midst in the church?
I think sure. There have always been a mixed multitude with God's people. I mean, I would say without a doubt. I think that we have everything in our church. But if you're asking, did the racist policies, or I would say the policies that reflected Jim Crow, were those because of racism? I can tell you what the original reason for them was. And that was initially when there were desegregated or unsegregated gatherings of blacks and whites, and an Adventist minister was in the South preaching to them and ministering to them. There was considerable friction, and there was often violence. Okay, they were often you'll see this. There's a big theme in Ellen White's writings around the turn of the century. It's called the closing of the South. And she believed that because of racial tensions and things of a incendiary nature, that the possibility, the portal, the window of evangelism in the South for Seventh Day Adventists would close, literally, and we would not be able to do evangelistic forays into the South. Now, really, since slavery's in 1865, the institution of slavery, we were persona non grata in the South, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they were Northerners, they thought like Northerners, they were pro-union, and they were anti-slavery. So already with that, forget about ideology, there was already a cultural difference. Okay, so many Southerners saw Northern Adventist evangelists coming to the South as, whatever, Yankee or carpetbagger coming here trying to impose their views on us. And so Elder Kibble mentioned R.M. Kilgore. I believe that initially he wanted to observe the segregation policies. Many times they were informal, they weren't always law, but the segregation informal policies to be successful in evangelism. Now that's giving him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, some of our ministers who went to the South could have been racist before, and what they encountered down there, jive with what they already believed. But the way that it was presented was, we need to reach this vast field, District Number 2. And in fact, when you read it in early Adventist literature, it was often classed with Europe, Australia, Micronesia, Africa, and then the South would be right there, because this is a vast unentered missionary field, right? Initially, they said this field has to be reached. We have to preach the gospel to everyone, and we cannot do it if we practice desegregation, if we practice total integration. They'll kick us out. It'll be closed. We will immediately be vilified. And so, if this may sound strange, but I think for many who were down south, many Adventist evangelists, they had a good motive, and that turned out to be Ellen White's motive when she wrote statements that are still quoted today that seem to countenance and justify segregation. She was saying, do this, number one, so that we can reach blacks and whites with the gospel, and number two, so that we won't be killed. Her son was in danger of his life. That's right. In the South. So she's saying, I don't want you killed, literally. And so, of course, we still use those statements now. So
one thing that I'd like to interject, there were laws on certain books that would suggest that for even a white person to assemble a group of black people, that they could be beaten with 39 lashes of a whip and fined an entire year's salary. That is what Edson White took on when he attempted to preach to the blacks. But because the laws of the sea were different than the laws of the land, he came up with a plan covertly to take them on board the Morning Star, to teach them and to disciple them, and then would drop them back off on the shore.
Yeah.
In First Testimonies,
And it needs to be said, piggybacking on what Dr. Kipple said, they were eventually kicked out. They were run out of the South. Where Edson said there was an incident with one of his converts, N.W. Oven, and he was shot and his wife was whipped by white vigilantes who were tired of the Adventists in the boat flouting the color line, and Edson left. Edson left the South. Now he came back later to start Southern Publishing and what became the Southern Conference in Nashville, but he left, and Ellen White feared that was the closing of the South. Now it ultimately wasn't, but they were effectively run out for what they were doing.
Trying to spread the gospel. In first volume of the Testimonies, page 264, paragraph 1, Ellen White said, God is punishing this nation for the high crime of slavery. He has the destiny of the nation in his hands. He will punish the South for the sin of slavery and the North for so long suffering its overreaching and overbearing influence. She also says this, and I quote, at the conference at Roosevelt, New York, August 3, 1861, when the brethren and sisters were assembled on the day set apart for humiliation, fasting, and prayer, the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and I was taken off in vision and shown the sin of slavery, which has so long been a curse to this nation. Elder Kibble, my question to you is, why was Ellen White able to so fearlessly voice her displeasure on the issue of slavery and the way whites were treating blacks, as she did with the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850? And she counseled white Adventists, I believe the year was 1859, to ignore that law. Why was a woman able to stand up so boldly and defy the law?
I believe it could be no other reason than that she was called of God. Those are not just human instincts and womanly passion. She felt called of God, and she was determined to do whatever necessary in order to advance God's cause. She was truly anointed of God. When I revisit Martin King's speech down there at the mall in Washington, and he talks about, I may not get there with you. How could he stand up there and advance that message? How could he do it? And now we are now hearing, and I have to thank Dr. Baker for this, that last trilogy that he added on the end was not a part of his original message, but one of his guests on the DS said, Martin, tell him about the vision. And he goes off into this antiphonal chant about mine eyes have seen the glory. Something more than humanity is at work here. And I think we see this in the ministry of Ellen White. She was a an anointed prophetess to the nation. And I believe that that's where her strength came from.
Dr. Baker, Ellen White was a stalwart champion for the rights, freedoms, and salvation of African Americans. And yet, there are some African Americans who are convinced that she was a racist. Why?
Like I said earlier, Pastor, her writings, and Elder Kipple said so much already. When Edson White and Will Palmer and the Southern Missionary Society went south down the Mississippi on the boat Morning Star, Edson began a correspondence with his mother in Australia. And he was sort of on the ground, as it were. He was a player in this whole drama in the South. And it was by no means the first, but it was one of the most significant. It was the first significant evangelistic forays in the Southland by a Seventh Day Adventist. Of course, there were others before, but I think because of Edson's stature as Ellen White's son and the drama and the epicness of taking a boat down, of assembling a team and taking a boat down for purposes of mobility, because they anticipated what was going to happen in the Jim Crow South. They knew they were going to have to be mobile and move. They knew that they could take people onto the boat and teach them there, and that they wouldn't get ostracized and persecuted like they would on land. And so they anticipated all this. And so Edson began, but they still ran into trouble. There was extreme turbulence. And so Edson was writing his mother in Australia. And I believe that her motherly instincts were seriously kicking in, because Edson's wife, Emma, she contracted malaria, and others were getting sick. In fact, she had to spend a lot of time in Michigan and other places because they weren't used to the mosquitoes and the heat. And other members of the Southern Missionary Society were facing persecution. They were castigated in the newspapers for being integrationists and for carrying these, liberal northern views of race. And of course, there was the whole issue of, a black man's around a white woman. So sexuality is mixed in there. And Ellen White was receiving these reports from her son in Australia. And as a mother, she wanted to protect him and the Southern Missionary Society and everyone involved. But I think primarily she wanted the gospel to be preached. And she knew, as eventually happened, I think it was 1899, that they would eventually get kicked out of the South, of a certain city, and they go from city to city, but that they would eventually get kicked out if they tried to observe what she originally said in 1889 and in 1891, where don't pay any attention to any color line. Because she said things like, would Jesus say to the black brother, you can't sit here? And so she said, there's no gospel of Christ in this. The gospel of Christ says we're all journeying to the same heaven. And black and white and the Asian man and everyone's name is written in the book of life next to each other. She said, God sees no color. Heaven sees no color. And so she was saying all this, but then when her son went down south and she saw the realities, and by the way, I think that it even got worse, right, as time went on, because she did predict race wars. She said, she said, I fear that it was like W.E.B. Du Bois in Souls of Black Folks. She said, I fear the color line will always be an issue. I think it will always be an issue. And so this was getting worse. And so she saw race wars, and she said the South will close and all of this. But she wrote her son. And from that, from the late 1890s, 1900s, where she wrote the 9th volume of the Testimonies, she changes her counsel. it changes for evangelism and for the safety of the Adventist workers down south. It changes. And when we're reading those today, our thought is, how could you capitulate on race and equality
So dramatic.
for any reason? For any reason. That's our mindset now. How could you do it for any reason? Even spreading the gospel. But she was a pragmatic, Matthew 24:14, this gospel must be preached. I want everyone to have the gospel. She would do what needed to be done temporarily to get it out. Now, once you know that, you can say whatever you want about her. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, once you know her motive, now then you can judge what you think about it. But she wanted to get the message out. And my goodness, that's what happened. Adventists in the South learned the gospel through the wrong segregation methods. Elder Kibble mentioned that God's purposes will not be stymied by any sin or evil that men do. And Ellen White knew it was evil, but she said temporarily until the Lord shows us a better way. We need to observe these laws just so that violence will not be perpetrated against us, and we will be cast out, and we can't spread the gospel to anyone.
You know, the same the same element of misprism is often castigated upon our slave fathers and mothers. And individuals today, even some African Americans, feel, why did they tolerate it? Why did they allow this to happen? Why didn't they rise up and do something? And it's because they are not fully understanding the context and the backdrop in which all of this is taking place. If the slaves, and some of them did rise up, and with John Brown and others, but if they had as a people done that, then the same thing that happened to the Native American would have happened to the slave. And they would have created genocide. And so it took strength for them to bow their heads, shuffle their feet, and say, yes, Master. Yes, Master. Because it was a matter of timing. And I think that even there, that God was leading. When they saw their women whipped and raped and beaten, as we saw in 12 Years a Slave, and they didn't have something to say, but it was timing. And I think it was the strength of courage just to hold your tongue until God shows us a way.
Some interesting comments here. Excuse me. Let's read them for the... Somebody left this comment in this video from a year ago. I worked for an Adventist hospital. There were no race issues at all there. I worked in HR, so I was in charge of hiring, so I was very aware of policies and EEOC/AA numbers. I'm not black, but the president of our 3 county hospitals and medical centers was. He was so inspirational, people would actually stand and clap when he would speak. We had a black female SVP over nursing and 2 black VPs. I can honestly say this was one of the few organizations I've ever worked for where I felt free to practice my belief of looking at content of character, not color of skin, knowing once hired, the employees would experience the same treatment throughout the organization. Yes, I'm Baptist, but I believe God's Spirit moved through Ellen White, and more importantly, I feel all the goodness that has resulted from their good work keeps the Spirit running through this organization. I've never seen so many people willing to do what they feel would be God's will. When the president of the hospital spoke, people would stand and clap. I think that God was God coming through him. When building a new hospital, he asked 300 employees to give up their increases for a year so they could build a community walking trail and lake for the community around the hospital. That was back in the day when you got a cost of living increase and a merit increase. I'm still in awe and amazed that he received 100% participation. There was no pressure, no continuous requests. They were excited and happy about it. I've never seen anything like it before or since, and I can tell you how many United Way, etc. promotions I've practically got down on my knees and begged for participation. Nothing but total respect for the Adventist. That's nice to say. Here's another interesting one. Oh, that's not the one. Let's see. This one? Oh, this is interesting. My ancestors became embroiled in the situation with the Edson White, that's Ellen White's son, who took the Morning Star ship down to take black people onto the ship and teach them there so they wouldn't be in violation of the statutes in the South. My ancestors became embroiled in the situation with the Edson White's Morning Star steamboat when it went on its mission to the American South. My people were racist white planters who were against the Adventists offering education to black people, and may well have been among the crowd that planned and failed to lynch the Morning Star people in Yazoo City. My great-grandmother, a planter's daughter, converted to Adventism, which caused a big division in the family because they felt she was crossing the color line. I researched this when writing Precious Jewels, the Seventh Day Adventist family saga, and it was clear to me why Ellen White was cautious about meeting racism head-on. Adventism was a very new religion, virtually unknown, founded by Northerners. And they were living in a time when feelings were violent between North and South, and as well as between the races. Elder Kibble and Dr. Baker seemed to have an understanding of the times in which she lived, and I agree with them regarding why her approach was cautious. Anyway, interesting.